Be human.
So students identifying as Black or Latino are more likely to say they would socially distance themselves from peers with a mental illness, a key indicator of mental illness stigma, according to research published by the American Psychological Association. Now, this study that's published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry examined how mental illness stigma varies across race, ethnicity, and gender in students between the ages of 11 and 13, which is a developmental period when stigmatizing attitudes and behaviors can become cemented and last into adulthood. So these negative attitudes may persist in adulthood, and these findings reinforce how stigma may prevent teens who face prejudice and discrimination from seeking help for a mental health problem when they need it. Emma Kate, why do these findings not surprise you?
For a couple of reasons. So it makes sense that we are aware of certain populations that are more aversive to mental health issues and talking about it being open. Again, I always think about the body and neurology, and there's a lot of research that talks about trauma related to environmental stressors. And so kind of long-term, low-grade environmental stressors that build up can actually cause cardiovascular issues that carry on into adulthood, can also cause even, certain issues to be passed on to the next generation through genetics. And so when I hear about people avoiding stress or avoiding somebody that has a mental health issue, that makes sense to me because these are populations where they are exposed to more stressors, whether it's sexism, racism, and the reality is they're like, whoa, we've got a lot already. And without it being on the conscious level, I think they probably are avoidant of those things to prevent more stress.
So do you think it's just that it's avoidance of stress because they're already overloaded with stress? Or do you think it's partly what Jonathan's talking about, which is that there is a stigma that is not being addressed?
I think it's probably both.
Yeah?
Truthfully.
How much of it do you think is the issue of it's still stigmatized in certain, kind of across the board, but particularly in certain minority communities, there are issues of mental health that just are not talked about.
Absolutely. I think a lot of what happens is our peer groups, our family influences, our communities, whatever sort of attitude and mentality is brought about really shapes us. And actually, this is random, but it's reminding me of the classic marshmallow test where for delayed gratification. And the key here is they had two groups for the study where they had little kids that were told that they had other kids wait to eat the marshmallow. And it was a fake peer group. And those kids waited to eat the marshmallow. And so there's so much power to these social forces that we're surrounded by, even imaginary ones.
So do you guys feel like, and I'll ask you to pull from your clinical experience, but also what you know in the research, do you feel like that stigma around mental health is getting less, getting better, or do you think it's about the same, or do you think it's worse? What's your take on that?
I think it's getting better. And that may just be anecdotal, but I think it's in part due to the whole pop culture, YouTube, celebrity situation where people are seeing people that they idealize or their idols that are talking about their mental illness or talking about their need for therapy or depression or what have you. And I think people are saying, well, hey, if they're able to talk about it, then I can talk about it. And then they find help.
Yeah, I think talking about mental illness has become more normalized and socially acceptable. I do think there's probably a great diversity amongst ethnicities and people of color. And I think part of that is it sort of seen as a more affluent problem because of resources, because of education. I do think that some of that stigma comes from being a person of minority status or even having generational immigrants in the family. Like you just have to, your outlook is you have to work harder. You can't come up with excuses because the system in some ways is already working against you. So this idea of like feeling depressed or feeling stressed, it's like there's almost like this cultural and collective, like you just have to get past that. You can't come up with reasons or excuses to hold you back because there are societal things that are already kind of holding you back in some ways. And so I think there's some of that going on. In terms of stigma, I think there's probably two other areas, though, that we're not getting better. I think one is we're not becoming more resilient. And so even though we can talk about mental illness, it doesn't necessarily translate in people developing coping skills and strategies toward it. And the other thing I'm starting to see anecdotally in the work that I do is that some people now have found their value and define themselves through their mental illness. And so with that, it really locks them in from getting help because that's how I'm known. I'm known as the anxious person. I'm known as the depressed person. And if they lose that identity, they feel like they lose their value and worth amongst their peer group.
That's a good insight. You know, one thing I've noticed, again, this is anecdotal, but when we were in Charlotte, you guys are still there, we saw, let's say 15 years ago, 20 years ago, a lot of not quite resistance, but secrecy around mental health issues. It was much more, it was tighter. It was much more, there was more reluctance to talk about it on the community level and when families would come in. And then over time, you started to see that ease up where families would see another family in the waiting room and they'd be not weirded out about it, but it would be an opportunity to go talk to them and for support. You would have kids have someone on their soccer team drive them to their therapy appointment. You would have someone bring in a girlfriend or a boyfriend. You know, you saw that over time where you could just feel the community becoming more comfortable with it's okay to seek help for mental health related issues. And I feel like Nashville is about 15 years behind that. Like, I feel like in some ways, Nashville culturally is an older soul than Charlotte. But in other ways, in terms of developmentally as a city, it is about 10 or 15 years behind where Charlotte is. And so when we first got here, we're seeing that same sort of like tightness and discomfort. And we're just beginning to see the openness. We're just beginning to see the more like greater willingness to talk about it on a more public or open way. So I think there are some good trends that we're seeing, and I think it varies by city, it varies by different groups and so on. So our hope is that we help destigmatize it in some way.
Thanks for watching this Being Human segment from the Shrink Tank podcast. To watch the full episode, click here, or to check out previous episodes, click here.